Thanks so much, Peter, and hello everybody. Thank you all for making yourselves available on this beautiful day to come inside and listen to us. But I'm delighted you're here. I'm also, of course, delighted and honoured to be involved in this process, and I thank the department for asking me to help them in this. I actually think this is an incredibly, and I'll go through this a bit more, an incredibly positive opportunity for the sector and for the broader economy. And I just echo the words of everybody who's spoken thus far to say I really positively hope that you will engage in this process as you see appropriate. But even though it means more work for me, I hope we get many positive and detailed submissions in this process, because it's only then I think that the work can really be done in the appropriate way. I'm not sure whether this works, but we shall see. No, somebody, Mark, could you flick the next slide? Thank you. And again, thank you. And again. So what I've been asked to do in a few minutes is just put this review into a broader context. I apologise because some of what I'll say, or maybe all of what I'll say, is well known to many of you in the room, but I think the context is important before we hear the really exciting speakers talking about the really exciting things that they're doing. It goes without saying, we all know that there's so many different aspects to space and the way we utilise space. And that, as the Minister said, but we're all aware, space is incredibly significant for this country. Like every major economy, indeed like every economy, we need access to a whole range of space activities 24/7, 365 days a year, but we of course have unique requirements in that regard. Australian institutions, governments, entrepreneurs, entities, etc., are already engaged in a broad range of space activities, from the research and science to the commercial and the implementation of that research and science. And we're very good at what we do. Next click, thanks, Mark. But as we're all aware, and as the Minister pointed out, things have changed. Things have changed quite dramatically. I often give talks to people about the challenges for space law, and really the biggest challenge for space law is the fact that technology is changing so rapidly. And it's changing so rapidly at an exponential level. So if you look, even in the last 3 or 4 years, how incredibly quickly technology has changed. And I think really, things will continue at that exponential rate for a long time. And so obvious question is, what does that mean for us here in Australia? Next slide, thanks, Mark. So the broad context, you're all aware, or most of you perhaps are aware, that from a legal perspective, space is akin to like what we call a global commons. Now, what that really means is that space is not regulated by national law. Space is regulated by international law. Next click, thanks, Mark. Primarily in terms of a set of foundational principles that came through United Nations treaties. And those treaties set some really important goals and aims about the way space should be viewed. But as you're all aware, those treaties are quite old now. They were all promulgated in a different geopolitical era. That is an era of the Cold War, in an era when there weren't that many actors in space, and those actors that were in space were almost entirely state actors. And obviously, things have changed since then. For a whole range of reasons, from the late 70s, we've essentially had no UN treaties since then. But of course, the activities ratchet forward, and the technology races forward. And so the UN, not always comprehensively, I have to say, has tried to look at some of those activities, not through the treaty basis. For a whole range of reasons, that's not going to be possible, but through what we might call soft law soft law mechanisms, guidelines that are not binding and voluntary. I hate this expression, soft law. I always say that. I think it's like saying something is half pregnant. But soft law is the appropriate way that most people deal with guidelines and codes of conduct. And that's really the way that we've moved in terms of the regulation of space. Next slide, thanks. And again, thank you. So, why do we need national law? Well, you're all aware that these treaties are binding on states. So Australia is one of only 16 countries in the world that's a party to all of the 5 space treaties. But all of the spacefaring nations are parties to at least 4 of them. But the treaties, of course, bind the states. Because the nature of space activities has changed, space, although still very important from a strategic viewpoint for states, has, as is demonstrated by those of you who are here, also become heavily commercialised and in certain aspects privatised as well. And so the actors in space are not private enterprises, non-governmental organisations, etc., etc. They are not, of course, bound by these treaty obligations. And so it's incumbent on states who are bound by obligations to regulate those within their jurisdiction, and they do that by virtue of national law. Next click, thanks, Mark. So, national law is important for a whole range of reasons. Australia needs to implement obligations that it has under these treaties, obligations to authorise and supervise, that's an international obligation, supervise national activities, various restrictions on certain types of weapons, to maintain registers, to take responsibility for space activities, and there's also a liability regime, you're all aware, under this international framework, which sits upon Australia, the Commonwealth of Australia, as a quote-unquote launching state. You're all aware that Australia is a launching state essentially when Australians are engaged in launching activities either from Australia or from overseas, but there are some other instances as well. Next. Another role of space legislation is, of course, recognising all of that to say what is the most appropriate methodology for us as a state in terms of regulating those within our jurisdiction, to find the right balance between, on the one hand, these obligations and liability and protecting the state as and how one sees fit, but on the other hand, to encourage, to facilitate, to promote, whatever words you want to use, the development of realistic commercial and research and science activities in your country. And it's a balancing act. For every country, the circumstances will be different. And for every country, the answers will be different. And our job here, and part of my role, is to find out, well, what are really the circumstances in Australia? And therefore, with that knowledge, what is the most appropriate mechanism for regulation? Next slide, thanks. As you're aware, both Peter and the Minister have already talked a bit about the Act. You're all aware that the background to this Act was in a totally different era for Australia, when in the 1990s in particular, it was envisaged, there was quite a lot of interest for Australia to become a major launch site for large satellites. That didn't happen. Ultimately, but the legislation was put in place with that in mind, and the objects and purposes and the motivation for the Act with that in mind. Next slide, thanks. So, in practice, so far, the Act has primarily been utilised for other things. That is, essentially, for the issue of overseas launch certificates for major service providers of telecommunication satellites and for other launches. Primarily for that, we've had returns, of course, but now, with the development of this capacity to do other things, licenses and the utilisation by Australia of its capabilities brings into focus how the legislation should act in that regard. Next slide, please. So, I think there are 3 key questions. They could be asked in different ways, but what are the additional opportunities? How can we build on what we're good at already, science, research, and the commercial activities that we're good at? And how can we build upon that? What's real, but how can we build upon that to develop further opportunities? does the existing framework, the Space Activities Act as drafted, inhibit those possibilities? Indeed, does it even inhibit existing activities that we're also very good at? And so, having considered those two, what is the appropriate framework that's necessary? Next slide, thanks. So, my role in this, as you've heard, is in the end to work with the department to assimilate all of the submissions, and I hope there'll be many from all of you and others, to then analyse the points that are raised, work out the impacts that may have in terms of the need for particular regulatory requirements or whatever, and then deliver that report to government. And government then will, and this is the first phase of what might ultimately lead to other steps by government. I hope they do. So my message, if I may say, clearly some in the sector believe that things are very difficult, that this is a very difficult sector to make progress in. I really believe this is a positive opportunity for the sector and for indeed all stakeholders to make clear, I don't speak as the government, but I'm involved in this process, make submissions that tell us what it is that is possible and real, and how can we translate what we're good at into new opportunities, and how can the regulatory environment help in that regard, and how does it hinder at the moment. And through assimilating all of that, hopefully we can come up with some suggestions and a report. As has been mentioned by Ros, there's an issues paper that's now gone out live as of today sometime. Hopefully that will help you in the framing of your submissions, but not necessarily limit you too much. I'm sorry I must rush, but we're on a tight schedule, and I really look forward to dealing and talking to all of you online, offline over the next couple of months, and thank you again for your interest. Thank you.